What if the only voice strong enough to condemn you to death was your own child's? Picture this. A courtroom in 1582, flickering candlelight casting shadows across oak-paneled walls. A terrified 8-year-old boy stands before stern magistrates, his trembling voice about to seal his mother's fate with tales of spectral cats and supernatural familiars. How did an innocent child's whispered testimony bring down the most feared witch in Elizabethan England? Tonight we uncover the craziest witch trial you haven't heard of, a story where family bonds shattered under the weight of fear, and where the very love meant to protect became the weapon of destruction. This is the tale of Ursula Kemp, the cunning woman of St. Osyth, whose healing hands would be twisted into claws of evil, and whose own son would become the star witness in her execution. But before we witness how blood turned against blood, we must first understand how an entire village became pricked by an ancient paralyzing fear. Why did the quiet marsh town of St. Osyth suddenly see the devil in every shadow? A village pricked by fear, setting the stage. The year was 1582, and England trembled under more than just Queen Elizabeth's iron rule. In the salt-soaked marshlands of Essex, where fog rolled in from the North Sea like ghostly fingers, the village of St. Osyth had become a powder keg of paranoia waiting to explode. Picture this forgotten corner of Tudor England. Thatched cottages huddled against the bitter coastal winds, their windows glowing amber in the perpetual twilight of economic despair. Crops had failed for the third consecutive year. Livestock died mysteriously in the night. Children fell ill with fevers that no physician could cure. And in the Gothic shadow of St. Osyth Priory, with its crumbling stone walls and empty bell tower, the desperate villagers sought someone to blame. Enter the Puritan preachers, their black robes billowing as they thundered from makeshift pulpits about Satan's servants walking among the faithful. Their sermons painted vivid pictures of the devil's army, cunning women who could sour milk with a glance, midwives who trafficked with demons, healers whose touch carried both blessing and curse. In a world where medicine was indistinguishable from magic, where survival often depended on folk remedies passed down through generations of wise women, these words fell on fertile ground. The villagers of St. Osyth had always lived with one foot in the supernatural world. They hung iron horseshoes above their doors, buried blessed objects in their gardens, and whispered protective charms over their newborns. But now, as hunger gnawed at their bellies and fear poisoned their sleep, that same supernatural world seemed to turn against them. By candlelight, neighbors who had once shared bread now whispered accusations. The woman who delivered your child might be the same one who cursed your cow. The healer who saved your fever-ridden son could be the witch who sent the fever in the first place. Trust became a luxury this impoverished village could no longer afford. And in this atmosphere of mounting terror, where every shadow held potential menace and every unexplained misfortune demanded a scapegoat, one woman's reputation for healing would soon become her death sentence. But which healing touch would become the fatal evidence against her? In the heart of St. Osyth lived a woman whose very name would soon echo through the annals of England's darkest legal proceedings. Ursula Kemp, widow, mother, and the village's most sought-after cunning woman, possessed hands that seemed to hold both life and death in their gentle grasp. Picture Ursula in her modest cottage, herbs hanging in fragrant bundles from the rafters, dried roots arranged in neat rows along wooden shelves. At perhaps 40 years of age, she had weathered the storms of Tudor life with remarkable resilience. Her husband had died years earlier, leaving her to raise 2 young children alone, including 8-year-old Tom, a bright boy with curious eyes who watched his mother's every move with fascination. But it was Ursula's gift that made her indispensable to St. Osyth's struggling community. When pregnant women faced difficult births, they called for Ursula's skilled hands. When children burned with fever, mothers begged for her herbal remedies. When livestock fell mysteriously ill, farmers sought her blessing. She could ease labor pains with a touch, cure warts with whispered words, and brew tonics that brought the dying back from death's door. In Tudor England, the line between healing and witchcraft was razor thin, invisible to all but those who dared to draw it. Ursula walked this dangerous tightrope with practiced grace, her reputation built on decades of successful treatments and grateful patience. She knew which herbs eased pain, which charms calmed troubled minds, and which rituals brought comfort to the grieving. To her neighbors, she was both blessing and mystery, a woman who trafficked in the ancient knowledge that physicians scorned but desperately needed. Yet, with great power came great envy. Other women in the village watched Ursula's success with growing resentment. Why should she profit from gifts that seemed to border on the supernatural? Why should her cottage never lack for food while theirs remained empty? In hushed conversations over washing lines and market stalls, whispers began to spread. Some claimed they had seen strange lights flickering in Ursula's windows at midnight. Others swore they had glimpsed peculiar shadows moving through her garden when the moon was dark. A few even dared to suggest that her remarkable healing abilities came not from God's grace, but from a far more sinister source. Young Tom Kemp absorbed these whispers like a sponge, his innocent mind struggling to reconcile the loving mother he knew with the dangerous figure emerging in village gossip. He had seen his mother's work, the gentle way she tended the sick, the tears she shed when she couldn't save a patient, the prayers she whispered over her remedies. But he had also witnessed things that confused his young understanding, the way she spoke to her cats as if they understood every word, the strange rituals she performed under cover of darkness, the visitors who came seeking help for problems that seemed to have no earthly solution. As 1582 wore on and the village's troubles deepened, Ursula Kemp's reputation began to shift like sand in a rising tide. The same hands that had once been praised for their healing touch would soon be examined for the devil's mark. The same voice that had comforted the dying would soon be accused of cursing the living. But what petty quarrel lit the fuse that would consume an entire village? When neighbors turned predators, the first accusations. The spark that would ignite St. Osyth's witch hunt came from the most mundane of sources. A dispute over chickens and cottage cheese that would escalate into accusations of supernatural murder. Grace Thurlow had been Ursula Kemp's neighbor for years, their cottages separated by nothing more than a narrow dirt path and a growing chasm of resentment. Grace watched with jealous eyes as villagers flocked to Ursula's door, coins changing hands for remedies and charms, while her own family scraped by on meager earnings. The final straw came when Grace's prize-laying hen stopped producing eggs after Ursula had visited to borrow a cup of milk. In the paranoid atmosphere of 1582 St. Osyth, such coincidences carried deadly weight. "She looked at my hen with those eyes," Grace would later testify, her voice trembling with manufactured fear. "And from that day forward, not a single egg. Then my cow's milk turned sour, and my baby fell sick with fever that wouldn't break." But Grace's accusations went far beyond agricultural mishaps. She claimed that Ursula had appeared in her dreams, threatening revenge for some imagined slight. She swore she had seen Ursula's spirit creeping through her garden at midnight, accompanied by shadowy creatures that defied description. Most damning of all, Grace alleged that Ursula had used supernatural means to cause the death of her infant daughter, a child who had died of fever just weeks after the chicken stopped laying. The accusation spread through St. Osyth like wildfire through dry thatch. Suddenly, every unexplained misfortune in the village found its source in Ursula Kemp's cottage. The baker's bread that failed to rise, surely Ursula's curse. The blacksmith's horse that went lame, obviously the work of her familiar spirits. The sudden death of old Martha Fletcher, clearly the result of Ursula's malevolent magic. What began as a neighbor's petty grievance transformed into a community-wide hysteria. Women who had once sought Ursula's help now crossed themselves when they passed her cottage. Men who had paid her for livestock blessings now whispered that she had cursed their animals instead. Children who had played with young Tom Kemp now ran from him in terror, as if his mother's supposed evil might somehow contaminate him. The village constable, overwhelmed by the mounting accusations, had little choice but to act. In a world where supernatural crimes were treated as seriously as theft or murder, Grace Thurlow's testimony carried the weight of legal evidence. The machinery of Tudor justice, with its assumption of guilt and its hunger for confessions, began to grind toward its inevitable conclusion. For Ursula Kemp, the woman who had spent her life healing others, the irony was cruel beyond measure. The same neighbors who had once blessed her name now cursed it. The same community that had depended on her gifts now saw those gifts as proof of her damnation. But the cruelest twist was yet to come. As the accusations mounted and the pressure intensified, the authorities would turn to the one witness whose testimony could either save or damn her, her own beloved son. But What did young Tom whisper that made seasoned magistrates shudder in fear? The interrogation of 8-year-old Tom Kemp would go down in history as one of the most chilling examples of how Tudor justice could weaponize innocence itself. Picture the scene: a stone-walled chamber in Colchester Castle, where flickering torches cast dancing shadows across the faces of stern magistrates. At the center sat a small boy, his legs barely reaching the floor from his wooden chair, surrounded by men in black robes who spoke in hushed, urgent tones about matters of life and death. Tom had been separated from his mother for 3 days, 3 days of careful questioning, gentle coercion, and the kind of psychological pressure that could break even hardened criminals. The magistrates, led by the relentless Sir Brian Darcy, understood that children's minds were malleable, their testimonies easily shaped by the right combination of fear and false comfort. "Tell us about your mother's friends," they urged, their voices deceptively kind, the special friends that only she could see. And so began Tom's devastating testimony, words that would echo through the centuries as a masterclass in judicial manipulation. In his small, trembling voice, he described 4 supernatural creatures that supposedly served his mother: Tiffin, a white lamb that could transform into a beautiful woman; Titty, a gray cat with eyes like burning coals; Jackie, a black cat that walked upright like a man; and Pigeon, a black toad that spoke in whispers only his mother could understand. The magistrates leaned forward, their quills scratching frantically across parchment as Tom's imagination, or perhaps his terror, conjured increasingly elaborate details. He described how these familiars would appear at his mother's call, how they would carry out her bidding in the dark of night, how they fed on drops of her blood drawn from hidden marks on her body. But Tom's testimony grew even more damning. Under relentless questioning, he claimed to have witnessed his mother sending these creatures to harm her enemies. Tiffin had supposedly caused Grace Thurlow's cow to sicken. Titty had killed the chickens that stopped laying. Jackie had entered the dreams of sleeping villagers to torment them with nightmares. And Pigeon, the most sinister of all, had supposedly helped his mother prepare the supernatural poisons that caused mysterious deaths throughout St. Osyth. The boy's words carried a devastating authenticity, precisely because they came from a child's mouth. In Tudor England, children were considered incapable of elaborate deception, their testimonies viewed as pure truth, unmarked by adult cunning. The magistrates recorded every word as gospel, building their case for murder upon the foundation of an 8-year-old's manipulated memories. Modern observers can only imagine the psychological trauma inflicted upon young Tom. Separated from his mother, surrounded by authoritative figures who rewarded certain answers while punishing others, he likely came to believe his own testimony was true. The line between reality and suggestion blurred until he genuinely remembered seeing creatures that existed only in the magistrate's leading questions. What makes Tom's testimony particularly heartbreaking is the occasional glimpse of genuine love that slipped through the coached accusations. Despite describing his mother as a witch, he would sometimes mention how she had nursed him through illness, how she had told him bedtime stories, how she had protected him from the village bullies. These moments of truth only made his damning words more believable to the court. The magistrates had achieved their goal. They had transformed a mother's love into evidence of her guilt, a child's imagination into proof of supernatural crime. Tom Kemp's testimony would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, the unshakable foundation upon which they would build their arguments for his mother's execution. As the interrogation concluded, the boy was led away, probably unaware that his words had just signed his mother's death warrant. The machinery of Tudor justice had found its perfect witness: innocent, believable, and utterly devastating. Could spectral kittens and phantom crabs truly sentence a woman to hang? Theater of accusation, the Chelmsford Assizes. The summer assizes of 1582 transformed Chelmsford's courthouse into a theater of the macabre, where spectral evidence would be weighed as carefully as stolen silver, and supernatural testimony would carry the same legal weight as eyewitness accounts of murder. Picture the scene: the great hall of Chelmsford Castle, its vaulted ceiling echoing with the murmur of packed galleries. Oak-paneled walls bore witness to the shuffling of parchment, the scratching of quills, and the hushed whispers of townspeople who had traveled for miles to witness this unprecedented trial. At the center of it all sat Ursula Kemp, her hands bound, her face pale but defiant as she faced the most powerful legal machinery in Tudor England. Presiding over this judicial spectacle was Sir Brian Darcy, a man whose meticulous documentation would ensure that every damning detail survived for posterity. His notes, written in precise Tudor script, reveal a legal mind convinced that supernatural crimes required supernatural evidence. To Darcy and his fellow judges, the realm of spirits was as real as the realm of flesh, and far more dangerous. The prosecution's case unfolded like a carefully choreographed performance. Grace Thurlow took the stand first, her voice trembling with rehearsed terror as she recounted her supernatural encounters with the accused. She described midnight visitations, cursed livestock, and the mysterious death of her infant daughter, all attributed to Ursula's malevolent magic. The packed courtroom hung on every word, gasps of horror punctuating her testimony. But it was young Tom Kemp's appearance that truly electrified the proceedings. The 8-year-old boy, coached and coerced until he believed his own testimony, delivered his devastating account with the kind of innocent conviction that no adult witness could match. His descriptions of Tiffin, Titty, Jackie, and Pygine filled the courtroom with an almost palpable sense of dread. Seasoned magistrates who had heard countless murder trials found themselves genuinely unnerved by tales of shape-shifting familiars and blood-sucking toads. The court clerk's quill flew across parchment as he recorded testimony that would have been dismissed as fantasy in any other context. The said Ursula Kemp did keep 4 several spirits, he wrote, whereof 2 were he's and 2 were she's. The 2 he spirits were called Tiffin and Jackie, and the 2 she spirits were called Titty and Pygine. Under mounting pressure, Ursula's composure finally cracked. The woman who had spent her life healing others now faced the choice between maintaining her innocence and facing certain death, or confessing to crimes she had never committed in hopes of mercy. The psychological torture of hearing her own son's accusations proved too much to bear. Her confession, extracted through a combination of legal pressure and maternal anguish, became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. She admitted to keeping familiars, to using supernatural means to harm her enemies, and to trafficking with forces beyond the natural world. Each admission was carefully recorded, her words twisted into legal proof of capital crimes. The trial's most surreal moment came when the court seriously debated whether spectral cats could indeed cause physical harm, whether phantom toads could carry messages between the living and the dead, and whether a gray familiar named Titty could be held legally responsible for the death of Grace Thurlow's infant daughter. In the fevered atmosphere of 1582, such questions were not merely academic. They were matters of life and death. The defense, such as it was, had no answer for testimony that existed entirely outside the realm of physical evidence. How could one cross-examine a familiar spirit? How could one provide an alibi for crimes allegedly committed by supernatural proxy? The very nature of witchcraft accusations made them virtually impossible to disprove. As the trial neared its climax, the packed courtroom held its collective breath. The evidence was overwhelming: a child's devastating testimony, a neighbor's accusations, and the defendant's own confession. The judges retired to deliberate, though the outcome had been decided long before they left their seats. When they returned, the words that echoed through the hall were as inevitable as they were chilling: guilty of murder by witchcraft. Whose names tumbled from Ursula's lips next, and why did one matter most? Dominoes of damnation. The web widens. In the cruel calculus of Tudor survival, Ursula Kemp made a desperate gamble that would transform her from victim into architect of village-wide destruction. Faced with the certainty of death, she chose to drag others down with her, a decision that would spread the witch hunt's poison through every cottage in St. Osyth. Under relentless pressure from Sir Brian Darcy, who sensed that one confession could unlock an entire conspiracy, Ursula's lips began to spill names like water from a broken dam. But this was no random accusation. It was a calculated act of revenge wrapped in the desperate hope of mercy. The first name to fall was Elizabeth Bennet, an elderly widow whose only crime had been to outlive her usefulness to the community. Ursula claimed that Elizabeth kept 2 demonic spirits, a red lion and a black dog, that she sent forth to kill livestock and spoil crops. The accusation was strategic. Elizabeth had no family to defend her, no powerful friends to intercede, and no resources to fight back. She was the perfect scapegoat. Next came Alice Hunt, a young mother whose prosperity had sparked jealousy among her neighbors. Ursula accused her of using supernatural means to ensure her husband's success while cursing competitors' businesses. The testimony was particularly damning because it explained away Alice's family's relative wealth in a community struggling with poverty. Surely only witchcraft could account for such fortune. But the name that mattered most was Alice Newman, and here Ursula's accusations revealed the true power dynamics lurking beneath St. Osyth's witch hunt. Newman was no ordinary village woman. She was connected to families of influence, with relatives who held positions in local government and trade. Her accusation represented a dangerous escalation that would test the limits of the witch hunt's reach. Ursula's strategy was as cunning as it was cruel. By implicating women across the social spectrum, from the powerless Elizabeth Bennet to the well-connected Ailes Newman, she created a web of accusations that no single family or faction could easily dismiss. She painted a picture of a vast supernatural conspiracy that touched every level of St. Osyth society, making her own crimes seem like mere threads in a much larger tapestry of evil. The ripple effects were immediate and devastating. Families who had lived as neighbors for generations suddenly viewed each other with suspicion. Women who had shared recipes and gossip now wondered which of their friends might be trafficking with demons. Children who had played together were forbidden from associating with the offspring of the accused. Sir Brian Darcy seized upon these expanding accusations with the fervor of a man who sensed a career-defining case. His interrogation techniques, refined through Ursula's confession, were now applied to each new suspect. The same psychological pressure that had broken the cunning woman would now be brought to bear on Elizabeth Bennet, Alice Hunt, and the others whose names had tumbled from her lips. The village's power structures began to reveal themselves as families chose sides. Those with influence worked frantically to distance themselves from the accused, while others saw opportunity in the chaos. Old grudges found new expression through accusations of witchcraft, and property disputes suddenly became matters of supernatural crime. But perhaps most chilling of all was how the community began to police itself. Neighbors reported suspicious behavior, children informed on their parents, and friends betrayed decades of trust in pursuit of safety or advantage. The witch hunt had become a self-sustaining engine of destruction, fed by fear and powered by humanity's darkest impulses. As more names were added to the growing list of the accused, the people of St. Osyth began to realize that no one was truly safe. The same testimony that had condemned Ursula Kemp could easily be turned against anyone who had ever practiced folk medicine, offered herbal remedies, or simply fallen afoul of their neighbors' jealousy. The dominoes were falling, and their crash would echo through the centuries as a reminder of how quickly fear could transform a community into a feeding ground for suspicion and betrayal. What grim relic surfaced 3 centuries later to remind us of her fate? A noose and a legacy, death and discovery. The summer morning of August 23, 1582, dawned gray and oppressive over Chelmsford, as if the very sky mourned what was to come. Through the narrow streets of the market town, a somber procession wound its way toward the gallows, a parade of death that would conclude one of England's most notorious witch trials. Ursula Kemp walked at the center of this grim theater, her hands bound behind her back, flanked by guards whose faces betrayed no emotion. The woman who had once brought life into the world with her healing hands now faced the ultimate penalty for crimes that existed more in fevered imagination than in reality. Behind her, in rough-hewn carts, rode Elizabeth Bennet and Alice Hunt, fellow victims of the hysteria that had consumed their village. The gallows stood stark against the morning sky, its timber blackened by weather and stained with the blood of countless executions. A crowd had gathered, drawn by the macabre spectacle of watching those they had once known swing from the noose. Among them stood young Tom Kemp, his 8-year-old face a mask of confusion and dawning horror, as he began to understand the true consequences of his testimony. The execution itself was conducted with the brutal efficiency typical of Tudor justice. No lengthy speeches, no dramatic last words recorded for posterity, just the swift mechanical process of ending lives that the state had deemed forfeit. The rope tightened, the trapdoors opened, and 3 women whose only crime had been to live in an age of superstition and fear breathed their last. But death was not the end of Ursula Kemp's story. It was merely the beginning of a mystery that would span centuries. In the immediate aftermath, the bodies of the executed witches were supposed to be buried in unmarked graves, their names erased from memory as if they had never existed. Yet somehow, Ursula's remains found their way to a secret resting place that would preserve her story for future generations to discover and ponder. The discovery came in 1921, almost exactly 339 years after her execution. Workers renovating an old cottage in St. Osyth made a chilling find: a skeleton buried beneath the floorboards, its bones telling a tale of violent death and hasty burial. The skull showed signs of damage consistent with hanging, and the body's position suggested it had been interred quickly, without ceremony or proper Christian burial rites. Local historians, intrigued by the discovery, began to piece together the evidence. The cottage stood on land that had once belonged to families connected to the 1582 witch trials. Carbon dating, though primitive by modern standards, suggested the remains were approximately 400 years old. Most compelling of all, the skeleton was that of a middle-aged woman, consistent with what little was known about Ursula Kemp's age at the time of her death. The archaeological investigation revealed other tantalizing clues. Buried with the bones were small iron objects, pins, nails, and fragments of metal that seemed to have been deliberately placed with the body. In Tudor England, iron was believed to provide protection against evil spirits, suggesting that even in death, someone feared Ursula's supernatural powers enough to take precautions. Modern forensic analysis, limited though it was by 1920s technology, could not definitively prove the skeleton's identity. DNA testing lay decades in the future, and historical records from 1582 were fragmentary at best. Yet the circumstantial evidence was compelling enough to capture the public imagination and reignite interest in one of England's most tragic witch trials. The discovery also raised haunting questions about the aftermath of the executions. Who had risked their own safety to bury Ursula's body with such care? Was it a family member, a friend, or perhaps someone who had come to regret their role in her destruction? The iron object suggested someone who still believed in her supernatural powers, but sought to contain rather than destroy them. Perhaps most poignant of all was the realization that Ursula Kemp's story had come full circle. The woman who had spent her life healing others, who had been condemned by her own child's testimony, who had died friendless and reviled, had finally found a kind of peace beneath the floorboards of a cottage that might have been her own. The skeleton's discovery in 1921 sparked renewed interest in the Essex witch trials, leading historians to examine the surviving court records with fresh eyes. What they found was a chilling reminder of how fear, superstition, and the manipulation of innocence could combine to create judicial murder on a massive scale. Today, the remains believed to be those of Ursula Kemp rest in a museum, a silent testament to the dangers of mass hysteria and the fragility of justice when confronted with supernatural accusations. Her story serves as a warning from the past, a reminder that the line between civilization and savagery is often thinner than we dare to imagine. Ursula Kemp's story warns us how fear can transform families into judges and children into weapons of destruction. What hidden terrors are we still willing to believe at the faintest whisper of suspicion? Subscribe for more forgotten histories before they too are buried forever.